We're back in our series going through the Psalms, and we are in Psalm 60. Psalm 60. Let's begin by reading through the psalm, and then we'll jump right into it. We'll start with the historical note in Psalm 60. To the chief musician upon Shushanaduth, Michtam of David, to teach when he strove with Aram Naharaim, I'm going to leave it at that, and with Aram Zobah, when Joab returned and smote of Edom in the valley of Salt, 12,000. That's the hardest part. O God, thou hast cast us off, thou hast scattered us, thou hast been displeased. O turn thyself to us again. Thou hast made the earth to tremble, thou hast broken it. Heal the breaches thereof, for it shaketh. Thou hast showed thy people hard things. Thou hast made us to drink the wine of astonishment. Thou hast given a banner to them that fear thee, that it may be displayed because of the truth. Selah. That thy beloved may be delivered. Save with thy right hand, and hear me. God hath spoken in his holiness. I will rejoice. I will divide Shechem and mete out the valley of Succoth. Gilead is mine, and Manasseh is mine. Ephraim also is the strength of mine head. Judah is my lawgiver. Moab is my washpot. Over Edom will I cast out my shoe. Philistia, triumph thou because of me. Who will bring me into the strong city? Who will lead me into Edom? Wilt not thou, O God, which hast cast us off? And thou, O God, which didst not go out with our armies? Give us help from trouble, for vain is the help of man. Through God we shall do valiantly, for he it is that shall tread down our enemies. All right. So, regarding that long historical note, which I will stumble through the pronunciations one more time. I practiced them, but they seem to look different when I tried to read them in front of people. Begins with, to the chief musician upon Shushanaduth. Now, that's actually a Hebrew word that has a literal meaning. And the literal meaning of Shushanaduth is lily of the testimony. And now, that probably is the name, at least so the commentators say, that is probably the name for a hexachord harp or a lute, which are actually two different things, so I'm not sure how sure they are of that. Michtam of David, you all know what that means. It's an engraving. It's one of the golden psalms. To teach, when he strove with Aram Naharaim. See, it's easier when I read it in 18 font. And with Aram Zobah. Okay, so those two are places. They're not people, they are places. And they speak of a conflict between David and Hadarezer and Hadoram. And then we continue that historical note, and it places it in time when Joab returned and smote of Edom in the valley of Salt, 12,000. This is from 1 Chronicles chapter 18. We're not going to read that backstory on that one ahead of time. It's a little bit scattered, and it's not all in one place in that chapter of 1 Chronicles. But it has the record of this whole series of events and subject matter that we find laid out throughout the whole psalm. There is in that chapter an apparent conflict between the number and the character who smote the enemies in the valley of Salt. But it always boggles my mind that there is a jump to conclusion that there must be a mistake, because it's not that hard to see what is intended. And I think it's an apparent conflict that's easily overcome if you keep reading after this report in 1 Chronicles chapter 18 that says Abishai slays 18,000, and not particularly in the Valley of Salt, but I didn't write that down. Something about the salt pits or something like that. So probably the general area anyway. And it was Abishai that slew 8,000. And our psalm says that Joab slew 12,000 in the Valley of Salt, right? So, or at least the historical note does. So, but just a couple verses later, it says that Joab is said to be over the host, and that Abishai was, just part of the conflict, and perhaps a different part of the conflict. And so perhaps he played another part, or maybe somehow can, as the commander, take credit for part of Abishai's 18,000. Anyway, it's not that big a deal. But it's definitely during this time period, which is the weight that the historical note has, is to place it in a time period within the reign of David. And so that overall context helps the most in applying the psalm to our lives, because we see where it lands in the reign of David, in the life of David, and in his his regal career, if you will. And so David has only recently taken the throne after Saul had died, because of Saul's obsessions and Saul's sin. And because of Israel's falling away from fellowship with God, Israel had ceded territory in the land of Canaan. And they had lost what was promised to them because they had disobeyed what was commanded of them. That's how it works, folks. God gives great promises when we obey him. And when we disobey him, we lose what was promised. And because these promises, as they are conditional, God fulfills the conditions. He doesn't just keep the promises anyway. He makes a condition. If you disobey and break the condition, then the promise isn't valid. And so you lose some of what is promised because you disobeyed what was commanded. And that's how it works in our lives. That's how it worked in that is how it has worked in the nation of Israel. And that's where we see a great application to a lot of what happens in the kingdom of Israel in the Old Testament, is to see that they are dealing with the same God with whom we deal today, right? He's made promises to us specifically as well, to the church, to us individually as his children. He's made conditional promises of blessing and victory in the Christian life, which is what Canaan would represent. And when we disobey his commands, we can expect to lose the benefits of the promises. So anyway, I think that setting that in its context helps us to make the application of this psalm to our lives. David, he's determined to rebuild the borders, to defeat the threats against the nation that has now been put in his care, and to bring the nation back to the greatness to which God had called it. And I don't know what his political slogans were, but we may find this is a powerful illustration and an example of how to take back the borders of our own lives, to defeat the threats and the enemies and return to fellowship with the Lord. And so by way of introduction, we see this Michtam of David was occasioned then by David's challenge on his southern border. And I'll say this often, as it was in the case of David early in his reign, often in our own lives, it is a new threat. It is a new enemy. It's a wake-up call in our lives that inspires us to come back to the Lord and to broaden and strengthen our borders the way God had intended originally if we had just been obedient, right? And there's often that final straw, if you will, that makes you decide, you know what? I don't like competing with the hogs for corn husks. I think I'll go back to my father. And the story hasn't changed, right? Men are stinkers everywhere, and that's us too. And we find ourselves in a place that we shouldn't be, and we think, if I just do what God said to do, I'll get some of those blessings that God promised if I did the things that he said to do. It's just a brilliant, epiphany that comes on. And so due to some national backsliding, Israel had lost territory to its enemies. David's determination to win back the land that God had granted, I see that as a challenge to us to regain our own borders in our lives. And so we'll just start with verses 1 through 5 and see. I have just two sections here. The first section is verses 1 through 5, and it's a call for healing and help. And I think even with the late start, we'll do okay with time here. And I'm just going to read that first section so that we see it as a unit. And, "O God, thou hast cast us off, thou hast scattered us, thou hast been displeased. Oh, turn thyself to us again. Thou hast made the earth to tremble, thou hast broken it, heal the breaches thereof, for it shaketh. Thou hast showed thy people hard things. Thou hast made us to drink the wine of astonishment. Thou hast given a banner to them that fear thee, that it may be displayed because of the truth, Selah. That thy beloved may be delivered. Save with thy right hand and hear me." So the first thing I see under this call for help, for healing and for help, is that David acknowledged God's judgment and God's displeasure. And herein David recognizes what is the reason for Israel's condition, right? It isn't, we've just had a run of bad luck with Saul, right? I've been really unlucky these last few years, right? It isn't just bad people not liking them, right? It's everyone else's fault. I'm doing fine, right? It's God's judgment and displeasure, and we would do well to recognize it when that's the case. And that when that's the case carries a lot of weight. I know that. But when it is the case, you probably know it if you'll really pray about it. Verses 1 through 3, we see this acknowledgement of God's judgment and displeasure. And you see it in the words, "Thou hast cast us off. Thou hast scattered us. Thou hast been displeased. Thou hast made the earth to tremble. Thou hast broken it." In verse 3, he says, "Thou hast showed thy people hard things. Thou hast made us to drink the wine of astonishment." Everything that David describes here is the actions of God against his people. He had cast them off. He had scattered them. He was displeased with them. He had made the earth beneath them to tremble. God had broken the ground beneath their feet. He had brought them into hard times, and he had made them experience things that were astonishingly bad. And David's acknowledging the judgment and the displeasure of God in the land that he is now ruling, the land over which God has made him a steward. And I think we may put ourselves into this situation when judgment does come, and when we know it to be in response to sin. That's really the key. We can remember that this judgment is against us as children of God. And why? It is because he made us stewards over our lives. Like David, we are a steward of Israel. Let me rephrase that. I just scrambled that. David was a steward of Israel. He has made us stewards of our lives. And we see then how David, laced within his acknowledgement of God's judgment and displeasure in verses 1 through 3, we see that he makes a request for attention and for healing. I have the same verses 1 through 3 for both of these points because he mixes them together. I just separated them so that we might see the two different elements of what David is saying in those three verses. And the first thing I wanted to show you was him acknowledging God's judgment and displeasure. That is one thing that we just set by itself so that we might make that application to our lives. Acknowledge the judgment, acknowledge the displeasure. And it is in that context then that we ask for God's attention and for healing. And so his request for attention from God and for healing from God, we see in verse 1 when he says, "Oh, turn thyself to us again. Turn thyself to us again." Having cast off his people, having scattered them, having shown his displeasure to them, David turns to God and he says, "Turn thyself to us again." He's asking for God's attention. And in verse 2, he asks for God's healing. You see there in verse 2 how God had made the ground beneath them to tremble. And I don't think he's talking about earthquakes so much as he's speaking figuratively of making that which had been stable shaky and unstable, right? It's like, I don't understand why all this insecurity suddenly in our nation and in our life. So the people in David's time might be saying, or so we might be saying in our lives. And David recognizes exactly what happened. We fell into sin. We didn't do things the way God said to do them. And things got unstable. Now David is saying, "Heal the breaches thereof, for it shaketh." If God has turned away, let's be clear, not in a relationship sense, but in a fellowship sense, right? Then God can turn back toward you. If he's made your world tremble and has broken you in response to your sin, he can heal you and bring stability back into your life. God does not bring judgment into our lives because he likes to see us in pain, right? That's not why judgment comes into our lives. It's not that God likes to see us in pain. His goal is restoration. That's why he brings the judgment into our lives. He's a good father. He has always done this with his people. So acknowledge the judgment. Acknowledge the displeasure from God and ask for his attention and healing. Next, we see David recognizing in that context the responsibility of the people of Israel to display the glory of God to the world. All right? He recognized his responsibility to display the glory of God. When we read all this together, and I won't do it again, but when we read all this together, we read verses 1 through 3, and we see the judgment and the displeasure of God upon his people, and we see the plea for God to heal them and for God to turn back to them. Verse 4 is a tone change. And I want you to see the tone change when he says, "Thou hast given a banner to them that fear thee." Right? Suddenly we're talking about the banner that God has given for his people to wave over their head and show the nations that he is their God. David doesn't have trouble leaping from begging God for healing and just to turn his attention to them. From leaping from that to, "You have given us a banner. You've chosen us to wave your banner in front of the whole world." He doesn't have any trouble seeing himself in that role and seeing his people in the nation of Israel in that role. And I think we would do well to see that is the hope of a child of God that is suffering the judgment of God for having disobeyed the commandments of God, right? There's not like a purgatory you go through first before God says, "Okay, we'll try this thing again." You know? He says, "Thou hast given a banner to them that fear thee, that it may be displayed because of the truth." There's a lot in that verse. And it's such a crucial verse that you see the word Selah at the end of it. There's also a tone change in the music is probably what that implies, right? So to those whose God he is, he gives all they need to glorify him. This is the banner. He gives them a banner to fly over them. It's a banner that tells the truth about God. He means for that banner to fly over our lives in a way that brings glory to him. And if by that banner David means something specific, right? Because he doesn't really say. He just says, God, you've given us a banner because we are among those that fear thee, right? So you've given us a banner. He doesn't really say what it is. It's very general. But I can't help but think of the song we used to sing in Sunday school, right? About his banner over us, right? And so if by that banner David means something specific, maybe a virtue that we can show that would display to others what we know of God, which is what the banner is, definitely, right? Perhaps David's son gives us the answer in the Song of Solomon. Don't worry, it's verse 2 and verse 4. He brought me to the banqueting house, and his banner over me was love. Now, look back at that verse 4 again. Thou hast given a banner to them that fear thee, to those that fear God, those who have entered into relationship with God on his terms. God has given them a banner. It's a banner that gives heart to those who march under it, for so banners were supposed to do, right? When marching into battle, that banner flying up there was important. Everyone followed it. That was what gave them courage, and it gave them heart. And it displays to all who see us what it means to fear God, because that banner also said something to the enemy. That's why they always wanted to take the banner down, right? Discourage the people. Because that banner says something about what the nation of Israel was. And so it is in our lives. This banner that God has given us to display to the world who he is. That which gives heart to those who march under that banner. Displays to all who see us what it means to fear God. And at the very least, what that means. That banner over us is love. And you may wonder why it's so important to display that banner. To show God to be loving through our own lives. Right? Think about that for a minute. Because didn't Jesus tell his disciples, they will know you by what? The love that you have for each other. Right, for the brethren. So then, this is the banner that Jesus spoke of to his disciples. Solomon mentioned that this banner over us is love. So then maybe what is being communicated here in Psalm 60 and verse 4 is that God has given a banner to his people, which is this love of God that we are supposed to be showing to the world so that the world knows who God is, what it means to fear God. Because the world does have an idea when you say those words, what it means to fear God. It means you better be careful because the old man upstairs will throw lightning bolts at you, right? But that's not really, that's not how we're supposed to be showing God to the world. We're supposed to be showing God's love to the world by loving the world. Let him love the world through us. So, anyway, so then you may wonder, to repeat myself, why it is so important to display that banner. Why is it so important to show God to be loving through our own lives? Here's why. Because it's true. Right? Look, that's what it says right there in verse 4. Thou hast given a banner to them that fear thee, that it may be displayed because of what? The truth. That's what matters to God is truth. He wants people to know the truth. God's interest is in truth. The truth is about him. This interest that he has in truth is the truth that is about him, the truth that is about us, the truth that is about our relationship with him, and the truth about how he never leaves his own and how they have security through the merit of God's own Son, that we can come out of a place that we shouldn't have been and we can come back into God's blessing and we can display that banner so the world knows, wow, that God that has been judging them now lets them fly his banner over them and proclaim that he still loves them. That says something about God. Why does he do this? Because of the truth. That's the last words of verse 4. Okay. Verse 5, we see not only did he recognize his responsibility to display the glory of God, and we talked about what that might mean. Verse 5, he asks for deliverance by God. And he says, that thy beloved may be delivered. Save with thy right hand and hear me. Now, I read that a couple of times before it hit me, that if I would reverse those two clauses, the order of those two clauses, then it would make more sense in English. Save with thy right hand and hear me, that thy beloved may be delivered. Oh, okay, there we go. Right, and it's typical Hebrew. It's a typical Hebraic pattern to lay out to lay out a truth or a reason, and then hit you with the truth on the other side of the bush. Right? I probably said that really terribly, but that thy beloved may be delivered, save with thy right hand and hear me. Anyway, David asks for God to save him because he knows himself to be God's beloved. Now that's a huge point, right? He leans hard back on that last verse, in which we posited that the banner over David was, as Solomon said in his own inspired musings, love, right? You may wonder why you could think it appropriate of yourselves to be so regularly calling upon the intervention of God in your life. Do you ever feel that way? Like, oh my goodness, I have asked him to help me for this thing over which I've stumbled so many times, right? And you may ask, well, why do I think it's appropriate to do this again? Why is it appropriate for me to ask for deliverance by God? I mean, why doesn't he just say, hey, work this one out on your own, you know? And let me tell you why this is so appropriate and why it is so proper, so suitable, and so right. It is because, look at verse 5, it's because you are the beloved of the Lord. That's why. It's because you are the beloved of the Lord, and his banner over you is love. And so from this cry to God for healing and for help, we move to a cry of confidence and of victory. I always loved how David is so confident in God's love for him. Not because David has always done the right thing. A lot of his psalms are telling God, oh, I've done terrible things, right? But he's always confident that God still loves him. And here he is leading a nation that has gone astray. And he says there, right there in verse 5, that he asks for God to save with his right hand and to hear him, so that his beloved may be delivered. He refers to himself and the nation as thy beloved. That's a pretty confident way to pray to God. God, the one you love is here. That's something, isn't it? So anyway, that kind of gets us ready for the confidence and the victory that is so clearly in his cry in verses 6 through 12. I keep looking at the clock and it keeps going faster, so I'm not going to read through the whole thing. We'll just read it as we go. So we'll start with verses 6 through 8 and see first here how David justifies his confidence and gives it foundation. And he says, God hath spoken in his holiness. I will rejoice. I will divide Shechem and mete out the valley of Succoth. Gilead is mine, Manasseh is mine, Ephraim also is the strength of mine head. Judah is my lawgiver. Moab is my washpot. Over Edom will I cast out my shoe. Philistia, triumph thou because of me. So it's in that first clause that I see the primary foundation of this grandiose proclamation, these grandiose proclamations of an ongoing condition of victory. He says, God hath spoken in his holiness, I will rejoice. Right? That's why he can be so confident in all of these statements that he makes here. What David is predicating his confidence in is that God hath spoken. But there's more to it than that even. God hath spoken, to be sure, but what else does it say there? It is in his holiness that God hath spoken, right? Now, you might rightly argue that God has never spoken in anything but his holiness. Okay, I'll give you that one. But we may at least assert that what God says here, he means to purposefully connect to his holiness. So the victory that we will see outlined in the ensuing verses, in the last part of verse 6 and then all the way through verse 8, is a victory that means to communicate the holiness of God to the surrounding nations. And make no mistake, God does mean to communicate his holiness to the world through the victories of your life. All right? He does mean to show his holiness. We've been talking about how his banner over us is love. And he means for us to show that we are his beloved and to confidently say to the world and display to the world that we are his beloved. And that shows his love. But by the victories of our lives, we show his holiness to the world. And so then when we fail in our lives, in the holiness of our lives and in victory in our lives, it is the holiness of God that we are disparaging as we try to reflect it to the world. So we may wonder next what that victory looks like in the life of a believer, particularly the kind of victory that communicates the holiness of God to a world that doesn't know him. And so we may read through verses 6 through 8 and see what it meant to the nation of Israel. And then we might make application to our lives, those principles that we know have not changed in the character of God. And I think it's pretty easily an application made. But what he meant to do in Israel, to show himself holy to the world, he means to do in us to show himself holy to the world today. And so you'll recall how we recognize this psalm to be written in a time after the reign of Saul and at the beginning of the reign of David. David is intent now upon taking back the land that has been lost due to neglect of the duties of the king, and who was the steward of that nation, and also because of the backslidden condition of the people who were called of God to victory in that land. And so he says with confidence, I will divide Shechem. This is, to make the application to our lives, I've called this a disciplined interior. Shechem is that land and that central city across from the Jordan fjords and deeper inland than Jericho, right? It represents the interior of the country. It's that place from which you might take the temperature of the country, in a sense. It was middle Israel, like middle America in our own country. It was not like a fringe or a border area, not as directly influenced by nearby countries. And God was determined that it be appropriately apportioned and organized. I will divide Shechem. The heart of a country matters, perhaps more than any other part of it. And there must be found in the interior of a country core disciplines that reflect the identity of the nation. And so must there be in our own lives. A disciplined interior, a clearly defined culture centered around the Word of God and our relationship with God. Next, we see a thoroughfare that is under control in Sukkoth. It's the last part of verse 6. And mete out the valley of Sukkoth. Now, where Shechem was deep in the interior across Jordan, Sukkoth was in the valley through which one would travel from the east of Jordan. I'm making all the reverse motions here, so don't look at my hands. But it works great for me as I make the motions. So that land on the east side of Jordan was also historically the national territory of Israel. And Sukkoth served as an outpost inside the border of Israel, but east of Jordan. It was the thoroughfare through which people would travel to come into Israel from the east. The valley was to be fully controlled and apportioned in an organized fashion, mete out the valley of Sukkoth. So must we, to make the application in our own lives, recognize the main thoroughfares and the inroads by which much of what enters comes into our lives. Just think about what it is. What avenue much of what enters into your life comes through. And that's a thoroughfare that must be under control. It's a means by which what shouldn't come into our lives gets filtered out, and that which belongs here comes in unimpeded. And we must control the thoroughfares coming into our lives as the Valley of Sukkoth must be meted out. Okay, the next thing we see is the high places being well defended when he says, Gilead is mine. Gilead's a little more familiar to us from the news today, and that as it represents the necessary highlands from which a country can be defended and from which threats may be seen from afar. And Gilead overlooks the valley of Sukkoth from the northwest. It too is east of the Jordan River, and it rises from the east shore of the Sea of Galilee. Okay, now the Golan Heights, you've heard that term for sure, and extend from there north as a defensive ring along Israel's northeast border. And it is said, who holds Golan holds Israel. And if we are to live in the kind of victorious pattern of life that God intends and that he has prepared for us, then we need to build towers on the heights. We need to make those areas of our lives from which we may see all that threatens from the outside. We need to make them places of indomitable strength. And one way we can do this is to maintain as public a Christian testimony as possible. All right? You think about this back in David's time, the towers on the Golan would tell all the nations around with Israel's flag flying at the top, oh, that's Israel, and they are well defended, right? We know who Israel's God is. We don't want to mess with them. Those towers, they're not crumbling. They're in good repair. What if we publicly and proudly in every area of our lives told everyone what our relationship with God was? Let me tell you what. That's a tower that discourages attacks from places that might otherwise try to pull you into sin. Like a tower extending from the crest of Golan. Let's inform all who might glance our direction that we are a taken land. We are a defended life. We are branded and labeled with the name of our Lord. Second part of verse 7 is the large places owned. Manasseh is mine. Manasseh was massive. It spanned both sides of the Jordan. It had the most territory between the two halves of Manasseh over any other tribe, even Judah. And it had Shechem at its center on the east of Jordan, and it spanned all the way to the Mediterranean. On the west of Jordan, Shechem was. Sukkoth was on the east of Jordan. On the east of Jordan, it reached past Ramoth Gilead and deep into the east, even further east of the Jordan River than on the west side towards the Mediterranean. And Manasseh was the center. It was the wealth. It was the cattle lands, the farmlands of Israel. And these are the large places, and they must be owned and they must be defended for the nation to prosper. You think of where you spend most of your time and from whence much of your resources come. That's Manasseh. That place needs to be every bit as owned by God and stewarded faithfully by his people as the small places. The next thing we see in verse 7 is the military strong in Ephraim. Ephraim also is the strength of mine head. Ephraim was the military strength of Israel. It was a smaller territory compared to Manasseh, but it's surrounded by Manasseh on two sides, still right there in the center, with Benjamin under it and Dan to the west. It's kind of like Missouri and Tennessee, and Ephraim turned out soldiers, right? These were men who were offended when they were not called for battle. They knew what they brought to the battlefield, and they knew what they defended. They had a strong understanding of who they were as a nation. And if we are to be strong and victorious in the Christian life, we'd better know something of the warfare in which we are engaged and something of the testimony for Christ that we are defending. The last part of verse 7 is Judah is my lawgiver, and here we see a government that is in power. Judah is the kingly tribe from which David hailed, and it was that into which Jesus was born. Judah was the birthplace of kings, the place from which rulers came. Any nation that hopes to live in security and in victory has to have a government that is in order and in charge. And so must we in our own lives be sure to empower those areas of our lives by which we are governed, right? We need to avoid delegating power in our lives to those or to that which have not him at its center. Verse 8, former oppressors enslaved. Moab is my washpot. Moab was a place from which oppressors came and from which Israel had even been partially enslaved. Moab is southeast on the border of Israel. And Moab was to become fully, not partly, fully under control. Is there an area of your life, a relationship or a temptation that has ruled you or any part of you? Subjugate that area so fully that it may be said, no threats lie here. There is no threat in a washpot. Next to those who had recently arisen in thought of encroaching on Israel's land from the southeast, this is the second part of verse 8. We see a current attacker to be conquered. Over Edom will I cast out my shoe. It made me think of a press conference with George W. Bush. Remember that? Well, it's just one of us. Okay. Somebody threw a shoe at him. Okay, it's not that. The casting out of the shoe is to put in your mind, think rather, let me put a different picture into your mind. The profile of a confident stride. Your leg forward, straight ahead, and coming in hard. There's no tiptoeing, no gentle step. There's no mercy that is to be shown against current attackers. By the way, so should we so vehemently go against the areas of attack in our lives as to leave no quarter, grant no space, and leave no survivors. After all, this is the land that God has given us. This victorious Christian life is what I'm talking about. Why should we tiptoe around and gently try to nudge against those who have come to destroy what is God's? Finally, to the original Palestinians. The last part of verse 8. I'm not making any kind of political statement here. I'm just giving you context. Former weaknesses, a strength. He says, Philistia, triumph thou because of me. These were those mighty people from the Aegean Sea who had made Israel its raiding lands, like Vikings who had set up shop down there in Gaza. They raided the south country of Israel so successfully that they maintained a constant and a historical threat to the country of Israel. The historical weakness of Israel against the Philistines had left such a real stigma upon the country that when Rome in the first century thought to demoralize Israel in what was called Judea, Idumea is, I think, the Latin pronunciation of that. And the Roman authorities renamed Judea to Palestine. That's where that name came from. And why'd they do that? They did that after the ancient kingdom of Philistia that had so long weakened Israel in Judea. And by that time, the Philistines had actually been completely wiped out. They didn't even exist anymore. But it was like an insult to Israel to rename their land on Roman maps as Palestine. So they used that name but that shows how much of a stigma that old weakness still carried, because that was the nation we just could not beat. Have you had a great weakness? By God's power, it may become your greatest triumph. Philistia, triumph thou because of me. Turn it into your great strength and testimony before the world. Next, we see David asking, and it's rhetorically, who it is that would lead them into victory. And let me assert this. He trusted God to lead them into victory. Wow. So verses 9 and 10, he says, who will bring me into the strong city? Who will lead me into Edom? Wilt not thou, O God, which hast cast us off, and thou, O God, which did not go out with our armies? So having made the confident claims for victory that he's made, David's now asking who's going to lead them into this victory. And you'd think by now he'd know who that was, right? He's not asking as a question of doubt. It's a question that's leading to an inevitable answer of logic. But it's not an intuitive logic, because the logic may not be immediately obvious to someone who doesn't understand the relationship that we have with God, or that God has with his people, whether they be the nation of Israel or the church today. The argument David makes is that God would lead them into victory, but why? Here it is. The God who cared enough to judge cares enough to deliver. Right? He says in verse 10, wilt not thou, O God, which hath cast us off, and thou, O God, which didst not go out with our armies? He's saying, would not this God, who cared enough to cast us off when we were disobedient, so that we might return to him and then deliver us, would he not deliver us then when we turn back to him? Would not this God who allowed us to bull rush into failure, right? Didn't go out with our armies. He says, okay, this one's yours, because I didn't say go there, right? And would not this God who allowed us to bull rush into failure on a path of our own choosing, so that we might see his path to be better, then go with us when we take the path that he's commanded? Well, of course he would. That's the logic David's laying out. I think sometimes our logic is not this good, right? Christians sometimes think, because God has clearly removed his hand of blessing when we have turned from his way, that he's mad at us. Here's the thing. That might be true. But the conclusion is often false, though, right? The conclusion is that that God gets mad just like we do, right? We get mad and then we hold a grudge for a long time, even whenever someone starts doing right again. And they just conclude, well, God's going to refuse grace to those who've returned to the path that they were supposed to take so long ago, right? David knows, though, that as soon as Israel embraces the way that God has commanded, he is ready to immediately lead them back into victory. That's the God we serve. And so it's failed logic to think, because we have sinned, now we have to do life on our own and make our own way. That's bad logic, right? But many Christians will see, they've sinned, I've sinned, and I've got myself in such a terrible place, there's no way God's going to help me. So I just got to muddle my way through this on my own until I get myself in a better place so that I'm more deserving of God's help. Well, you're not going to get closer to him that way. He says, turn back to me. Do it my way. We may treat people that way. God doesn't. Don't assume that he's unforgiving. David knows it must be this way. He knows that he is the beloved of God, and that God is looking to bless the obedient. David knew victory would come no other way. He knew that victory could not be won in the power of man. Verse 11, give us help from trouble, for vain is the help of man. David knew he could not trust the ways and the schemes of man. God didn't judge Israel so that they would prove they could do it without him, right? He judged Israel to prove that they couldn't do it without him. And he's ready to help them from trouble just as soon as they return to him. And David's not in doubt as to the fullness of the victory that God would bring. He knows God will completely conquer his enemies. Through God, we shall do valiantly, for he it is that shall tread down our enemies. So it's time we admitted the incursions at our borders. It's time we acknowledged the judgment of God for our sins. And in the power of God, take back the land that God has promised. That is Psalm 60.